Hi everyone, welcome to today's Facebook Live. I am Dr. Andi. I'm going to be answering all of your keto questions today. While we give people a chance to log on and join us, I'll just give you a little bit of background about me, who I am and about my practice, and then I am going to launch in and start answering all of your questions. So I am a naturopathic physician. I have been practicing in Toronto, Canada. It's a finally beautiful sunny day up here. We're finally moving into summer. I've been practicing in Toronto for over 10 years now. I have personally been keto for much longer than that, but my practice and the foundation of my practice really stems from keto. I've been with Prove It from the very beginning. I was at the very first Keto Academy, the very first keto event. Sort of sharing and educating, answering your questions, which as you know is something I love to do. And so essentially my background in practice was initially in sports medicine. I started with a focus on athletes. I was a dancer, personal trainer, practiced a lot of martial arts, and then slowly moved into focusing a bit more on hormonal balance, especially looking at things like insulin balance. And then I moved into metabolic nutrition, and again, since keto was something that was already part of my lifestyle, it was something I incorporated into the foundation of my practice. There are about 19 practitioners in our practice, and all of us function from a low-carb or keto standpoint. And so we all really use the ketogenic diet as a foundation as part of our protocols. So it's something that we all embrace. It's a very integrative clinic. All right, your questions are already coming in, so I'm going to get started. I'll start answering your questions. Oh, and a few comments about other people who were at the very first keto event. Yes, it was a great event, and it's actually been really incredible watching how the Prove It community has grown from that very first day. So it's really been a wonderful experience working with all of you since then. So let me launch in so I can see all of your questions coming in. So let's launch into that and let me get started. So the first question was intermittent fasting, and will taking ketones or your Ketos, Ketonat break your fast? So I do allow my patients to consume ketones during that fasting window. Essentially what's happening during that fasting window is we're trying to induce something called autophagy. And essentially that's a process that allows us to clear out or remove dead cells and allows our body to regenerate, create new cells. And one of the ways that we do that is by diminishing our insulin levels. High insulin levels will impede or inhibit that process of autophagy. So when we're fasting, we get that peak of a decline or a decrease in our insulin levels just around that 12-hour mark, and then that's where we move into extended fasting to see even greater declines in our insulin. So what we want to make sure we're doing in that fasting window is not spiking insulin and therefore impeding and breaking that fast and turning off that autophagy. So a lot of the benefits of intermittent fasting have been linked to the actual production of ketones. So I do allow my patients to have ketones during that fasting window because it's encouraging part of what it is that we're trying to do during that fasting period. Which again, and ketones will not spike or induce an insulin response, unlike sugar or glucose, it will do that. And fats won't do that either, so I also let my patients have MCT oil or their 143 in that window as well. So some questions about ketones and exercise and exercise performance. There's been a lot of really great research about ketogenic diet, exogenous ketones when it comes to performance. And what they've actually found is that ketones, beta-hydroxybutyrate, is actually a preferred or almost a better or superior fuel source to the body. When we consume ketones or when we use beta-hydroxybutyrate, we can create energy or ATP, and when we do that, when we use BHB to create ATP or energy, we actually use less oxygen. So a lot of people will say that they're consuming ketones prior to a workout and they find that they have an enhanced performance. Their endurance is a little bit longer, or their weightlifting is a little bit better, and that's because it's allowing us to create that energy and use less oxygen while we do it. We also know that the ketones are a superior fuel source for the brain as well. So that's where a lot of people will notice that difference with mental clarity and with focus, because that beta-hydroxybutyrate can be used as a fuel source in the brain. So I was seeing some questions about weight loss, and I think one of the questions about weight loss was someone whose weight loss has stalled at 2 weeks, or at 2 weeks you hadn't seen the weight loss results you want. So I'm just going to touch on weight loss overall. Essentially with the ketogenic diet, the first thing I like, or exogenous ketones, sorry, the first thing I like to remind everyone is that it's not a weight loss supplement. And the reason that we see fat loss, which is how I like to refer to it, the reason we see that fat loss is as a secondary benefit to what the ketones are actually doing in our system. And so we see changes in insulin sensitivity. It improves our insulin sensitivity. It decreases our blood glucose levels. We're seeing changes in our appetite, in our satiety, so our sense of being full. And we know that beta-hydroxybutyrate actually impacts our hormones, so leptin and ghrelin, the hormones that say I'm full or I'm hungry. So we'll see a lot of changes in food cravings and appetite, and then those changes in our insulin levels. We know insulin, I've talked about a fair bit today. So insulin is essentially a storage hormone. Our body releases insulin in response to glucose. And when our body has insulin, insulin says store fat. And so we want to store fat. It often goes right around the middle. And so essentially what we see as that secondary benefit of consuming ketones is fat loss. So what I say when it comes to fat loss is every person will experience weight loss in a different way. And the weight loss will actually, some people will experience weight loss much faster, but it depends on your personal metabolic state. And I see another question asking, is weight loss due to the diet or the ketones? There are some people who engage in, or who elevate their blood ketone levels through supplementation alone, and they don't engage in a ketogenic diet, and they will still see benefit when it comes to fat loss. You do see benefit as well when you merge both a keto diet and exogenous ketones, so you will see benefit when you put them both together. But for those, a lot of people aren't quite ready to move into a ketogenic diet based on their metabolic state. Their body can't go into ketosis just yet. For some people it might take 4 or 6 weeks. Other people it can take 3, 4, 5 months, again depending on that metabolic state. So the exogenous ketones can be really helpful in meeting those fat loss goals when someone can't follow the ketogenic diet. So again, it could be the diet will enhance the results, but you will still see results when you're consuming exogenous ketones as well. And so when it comes to someone who's saying they're not seeing those weight loss results as quickly, it's just a matter of understanding what your own metabolic state, or where you are from your own metabolic state, and then you have to make sure you're looking at other factors that might be impeding your ability to lose fat. So if you're a woman, you're moving into menopause, a man moving into andropause, hormonal imbalance, stress, microbiome dysfunction, systemic inflammation, all of those things will impede your ability to lose weight. So you have to make sure that you're addressing your medical conditions as well to make sure that you're getting those optimal results. So some questions about depression and postpartum depression. So there's been some really interesting research looking at the role of beta-hydroxybutyrate in depression. And so what we're actually finding, and when it comes to postpartum depression, there are a few other factors involved though. So you have to make sure that you're getting a really full, a really comprehensive and a really full assessment. Postpartum we often see is due to that massive or rapid decline of progesterone. So you have to make sure that you're also managing the hormones and what's happening after you've given birth. So there are some other factors there that you really need to consider. There are some other factors that need to be taken into account when it comes to postpartum depression, again with progesterone being one of the primary factors. So make sure you get that checked out as well. But from a mental health standpoint, there's some really interesting research looking at the role of beta-hydroxybutyrate and the neurotransmitters in our brain. So our neurotransmitters are just chemical messengers, so things like GABA or serotonin, and they actually modulate our sense of joy, our mood, again, our sense of calm. And what we've found is that beta-hydroxybutyrate can actually impact our production of neurotransmitters, specifically GABA. And GABA is a very calming neurotransmitter. It's very calming to the nervous system. And GABA is something that I also often use in those who suffer from anxiety and sometimes in depression as well. So there is some really interesting research in that space. Again, we can't say that that exogenous ketones are going to cure any medical condition that you have. So you do have to make sure that you work with your healthcare provider Make sure that that's right for you and that that's safe for you. But there is some research that showed that it could be beneficial, so there might be an option there if your providers say that that's the right thing for you to take. So kidney health, questions on kidney health and dialysis. So we get that question a lot, and that kind of ties into the question of, is this going to harm my kidneys? Is it going to harm my liver? And so the answer to that is, up to this point, we haven't seen any research to show that ketones are detrimental to the health of the kidneys or the liver, or that exogenous ketones are detrimental to the health either. There's actually some research that's shown that it could be beneficial to the function of liver, and there are some studies looking at those who are on dialysis who are following a ketogenic diet, and they have found that their outcomes are actually more positive when they're following a ketogenic diet on dialysis. So there might be benefit. There could be some potential benefit from taking exogenous ketones, but you absolutely have to work. With your healthcare provider and make sure that they say that that's safe for you, because there are a lot of other factors going on when it comes to someone who has impaired kidney function and who is on dialysis. So gallbladder, can you take exogenous ketones, or any concerns around exogenous ketones or the ketogenic diet when you don't have a gallbladder? The concern is often the consumption of fats. And so anytime I have a patient who's had their gallbladder removed, right off the bat, I have them taking a digestive enzyme with ox bile. And so we're trying to replace the function of the gallbladder. And so the concern is that after it's been taken out, we can't digest fats effectively. So you do have to take that into account if you're following a ketogenic diet. You absolutely have to take that into account for a ketogenic diet, because it is a higher fat diet. So you have to make sure that you're taking your ox bile. But when you're taking exogenous ketones, it's not so much of a concern, because exogenous ketones, you're not consuming high fat sources. Again, you have to check with your healthcare provider, but not having a gallbladder shouldn't be an issue when it comes to consuming exogenous ketones. So measuring your measuring your ketones. If someone's been taking the ketones, they're measuring through urine and they're not seeing a high level. So essentially, when we measure our ketone levels, we want to measure our ketone levels in our blood. Urine and breath are not the most accurate way to measure our ketone levels. Once our body is adapted to using ketones or making use of our ketones, they are water soluble, so they won't accumulate, they won't store in our tissues, our body won't store them. If you don't need them, they're released in the urine. And so that's why people will often measure the urine ketones to determine if they're in ketosis. But as your body becomes more adept at using the ketones, fewer will be released through your urine. So if you're checking urinary ketones, you might feel that, or you might see that the score, or the range of ketones is a little bit low. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're not in ketosis. It could just mean your body's actually using the ketones that has been exposed to, that it's creating, or that it's been given. So you want to measure your blood ketone levels to really get an accurate reading if you're in nutritional ketosis or not. So absolutely, you should measure your blood and not your urine to get a better sense of if that's true or not. So can you do the reboot if you're sick? That's a great question. So the interesting thing about intermittent fasting and extended fasting is that there's been some research to show that it also can sort of reset our immune function in our immune system. So I would say it depends on the degree of illness. It depends on what it is you're suffering through, or if it's a flu, whatever that might be. Often when people are ill, they're not able to eat large amounts of food anyway. So for my patients, I'm okay if they, again, depending on what it is that they're dealing with or going through, I'm okay if they do a reboot if they're not feeling well. But you have to remember that is a bit of a stressor on the body when you're extended fasting in that way. So you have to make sure that your body is prepared and capable, of managing that stress. So that would be sort of on a case-by-case basis. But I do have patients that I have allowed to do the fasting while they're not feeling well, and there's no problem with that. So I'm getting some more questions about gallbladder. I just talked about that a little bit earlier. So just rewind a little bit after the video, and I have an answer on gallbladder. And some more thyroid questions. So I saw a little bit earlier a question about Hashimoto's. so autoimmune Hashimoto's. So I'll touch a little bit on Hashimoto's and thyroid. There's another thyroid question, so I'll touch a little bit on the thyroid question. So the first thing, when it comes to Hashimoto's, we have to remember that's an autoimmune condition. We can develop an autoimmune condition at any point in our life. A lot of people will say we don't know what causes an autoimmune condition, why we develop autoimmune conditions, but I can pretty much pinpoint with all of my patients the exact stressful event that preceded the development or the onset of their sort of autoimmune condition. And so most people will know that there's a stressful event that leads up to that autoimmune condition development. We know that stress causes a lot of free radical damage in the body, oxidative stress in the body. So when it comes to an autoimmune condition, we see underlying factors that might be contributing. So the underlying factors that could be contributing are oxidative stress and the inflammation that stress causes on our body. We see mitochondrial dysfunction, and we see changes in what we call BDNF, which is a protein in the brain. So I'll talk a little bit about all of those. So oxidative stress is what we talk about when we talk about free radicals. So you've probably heard people talk about resveratrol or drink your red wine for your resveratrol levels. It's because it's an antioxidant binding some of those free radicals created due to oxidative stress. And those free radicals will move around the body and they damage cells, they damage our genes. So we want to make sure we're trying to combat that free radical damage that's happening due to high stress. And what we've actually found is that, or the studies are showing, is that beta-hydroxybutyrate is actually helpful in helping the body manage oxidative stress and sort of blunting that body's response to oxidative stress. It will also increase our glutathione levels, and glutathione is one of our primary antioxidants. We need our glutathione to help bind and manage those free radicals. So beta-hydroxybutyrate can actually improve that production of glutathione, which helps manage some of that free radical damage. We also see underlying mitochondrial dysfunction in autoimmune condition, and the mitochondria is kind of the generator of the cell. That's how our bodies make energy. We know that beta-hydroxybutyrate can increase or induce glutathione production, and glutathione is used in the mitochondria to help the body make energy. So we have two functions there. We are managing that oxidative stress and we're increasing that glutathione, and then we're optimizing the function of our mitochondria, which is where we actually create our energy. And the final thing on that is the BDNF, which is a protein in the brain that allows us to create new neuronal pathways in the brain. In the past, we thought, if we lose cells or we thought that we couldn't regenerate, we couldn't create new pathways in the brain. We know that that's not true. And there's a protein called BDNF that's highly associated with creating those new neuronal connections in the brain. And we find with autoimmune conditions, those who suffer from autoimmune conditions have low BDNF levels. So we actually measure BDNF, and there's a genetic component of BDNF. So we actually measure that to see if someone has low BDNF. And so when it comes to autoimmune, we try and optimize those underlying functions. So the BDNF, the mitochondria, and that free radical damage. So some more questions we're having about fasting. Can you have broth and still be in ketosis? Yes, absolutely. I encourage when people are fasting, when they're in nutritional ketosis, to absolutely continue to take that broth. We need those electrolytes and those minerals. Often the beta-hydroxybutyrate, the ketones, or the ketogenic diet can be a bit dehydrating. So we want to make sure that we're replenishing those nutrients. It causes us to lose water, so we can lose sodium or magnesium. So we want to make sure that we replenish those. So yes, absolutely, you can use broth. You can use broth during that fasting window. So ketones and menopause. Lots of questions about ketones and menopause that I'm seeing. So there's some really great information on the role of the ketogenic diet and exogenous ketones and hormones. Obviously, if you're moving into menopause, we're not going to be able to, we're obviously not replenishing hormones. The only way to do that is through hormone replacement. So as you're losing those hormones, though, people become symptomatic. So for menopausal women, what happens as those hormones change is you become insulin resistant. the body becomes overly stressed and we have a very high cortisol release. So we release extra cortisol, which also contributes to weight gain. And when it comes to the symptoms of menopause, women will talk a lot about hot flashes or night sweats. And my patients who are not menopausal, who suffer from adrenal fatigue, will suffer from those same symptoms. So those who are adrenal or chronic fatigue will have sweats during the day. They'll find that they're having night sweats as well. When you move into menopause, the function of your ovaries starts to decline, and then your adrenal glands have to take over the function of hormone production. So the adrenal glands now have to manage stress, and they're managing hormones. So often that component of, we often see that component of hot flashes related to the extra stress on the adrenal gland. So we've actually found, the research has actually shown that beta-hydroxybutyrate does play a role on our HPA axis, which is our stress axis, the axis that comes from the brain and goes into our adrenal glands and causes the release of hormones. So it actually has a cortisol, I should say, which is our stress hormone. So it actually has a beneficial impact on that HPA axis. And when women move into menopause, where they spike cortisol, cortisol specifically causes storage. It's a storage hormone, so it'll cause fat storage, again, right around the middle. And then women are also becoming insulin resistant. And insulin, as I mentioned earlier, is also a storage hormone. And again, it's going to cause you to store fat right around the middle. And it's fat that isn't just under the skin, it's visceral fat that surrounds our organs. So it's the fat that increases our risk of metabolic syndrome. So there could be some benefit from the exogenous ketones when you move into menopause, from managing the insulin resistance, managing that enhanced stress or that HPA axis, and helping to manage that and to bring down that insulin resistance a little bit so we don't release or produce as much of those fat storage hormones. So there could be some benefit as well. Again, it's not going to replace any hormones that we've lost. But yes, there could be benefit. And in menopause, I see a lot of women who suffer from brain fog, cognitive decline. It is very frequently hormonally related because we've lost a lot of those hormones in the brain that we need for cognitive function. But we know that ketones are a very powerful fuel source for the brain, so there could be some benefit as well when it comes to that cognitive function or that brain fog that women report that they experience as well. So questions about diabetics and the REBOOT. So I'll talk about diabetics just sort of in general, and then I'll talk about diabetics with respect to the REBOOT. So diabetics are probably the group of people who do need to be very aware when they engage in a ketogenic diet or if they engage in exogenous ketones. So the concern is always the risk of diabetic ketoacidosis. If your body creates insulin, there's sort of a feedback loop where ketoacidosis is not physiologically possible. If you have insulin in your body, you cannot go into diabetic ketoacidosis. And so the problem with those who have type 1 diabetes, obviously, is that they don't make insulin. And then in late stage type 2 diabetics, they may also be dependent on insulin. So we also know, though, that the exogenous ketones can help improve insulin sensitivity. So when it comes to diabetics, I always say you have to work with somebody who is knowledgeable or well-versed when it comes to ketones, exogenous ketones, ketogenic diet, and you have to measure your blood ketones as regularly as you measure your blood glucose levels. And you also have to be a controlled diabetic. You have to make sure you take your medication regularly. You have to make sure that you're very much on top of those things. So if somebody's not a controlled diabetic, I don't recommend that they do that until they've gotten that condition under control, and then to working with a healthcare provider who really knows what they're doing with respect to ketones and exogenous ketones. And then when it comes to the REBOOT, yes, I do allow my diabetic patients to engage in a REBOOT. Again, you have to work with your provider, because if you're on medication, I don't want you to become hypoglycemic. So there are some adjustments to medication that might have to happen while you're moving through the REBOOT. So you just have to be cautious if you're diabetic, and make sure that these are things that they're things that you're monitoring regularly. So edema. So I think that means if you've taken exogenous ketones and you're experiencing swelling, that usually is related to dehydration or loss of some of those minerals. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but it does mean that you need more fluid and more minerals. So I would add in the mitoplex. I often encourage people to put the mitoplex right into their ketones and just take them together. You can mix it right in, that's absolutely no problem at all. And that sort of will help with any of that swelling that you might experience, will help to replenish any of those minerals that you may lose. And so I'm going to end today on the question of how do I take ketones during the day? What do I suggest? How do I suggest people take them? So my suggestion is I usually encourage taking them twice a day. So I encourage intermittent fasting, which is that 16-hour fast from dinner until your first meal the next day. I encourage 16 hours about 5 times a week, 24 hours once a week, and a reboot once a month. And then during that fasting window, I encourage ketone consumption, as well as that MCT oil, which you can put in your coffee or not, completely up to you, but your MCT oil in that window as well. And then later on in the day, in the afternoon, around 3 o'clock, kind of where people usually experience an energy dip, that's where I'll encourage the second serving, or right before a workout, so you can get some of the benefits to really fuel your workout right before you go into the gym. So that's often what I'll recommend. I do have some patients I have taking more than twice a day. When I'm looking for a therapeutic outcome, I might ask somebody to take it 3 times a day. It just depends on what it is that we're treating. As I mentioned before, it would be very, very difficult to overdose on ketones because they're water soluble. So if your body isn't using them or making use of them, they're just going to be eliminated through your urine. So I hope I answered all of your questions. I know we have some really great events coming up in this weekend, one down in Mexico and one in Toronto, and funny enough, I won't be in the one in Toronto now that we have one here. So I hope some of you will be in attendance. If you're going to be at either one of the events, please come and say hello, ask me your questions, share your story. That's always my favorite part of the Prove It community. And as always, I'll try and go through and answer any questions I missed. Enjoy the rest of your week, everyone.